Almost everyone seems to agree school buildings in Rhode Island need hundreds of millions of dollars in renovation and improvements. The debate seems now to be whether the state can afford to borrow the money to fix the schools and whether this will leave the state in a precarious position when it comes to borrowing money for other projects down the road. Mark Murphy is the editor of the Providence Business News and is here to discuss the problem, which is the topic of the cover story in this week's edition of the newspaper, in print and online. How much debt is too much for Rhode Island? And there's a lot of outstanding debt, apparently.
Well, yeah, Rhode Island has a sort of, if you go by debt to revenue ratio, the national calculations are about 6.4%. The national average is 4.3%. So Rhode Island has a higher debt to revenue ratio than sort of the rest of the nation.
I know when people hear things like debt to revenue ratio, they might tend to glaze over, but this is very important stuff, especially because state officials want $250 million now for school repairs and another $250 million, I think, in the year 2022. And that means you have to do general obligation bonds to make this all work.
Yeah, and here's the issue, is how much can Rhode Island pay back? And there was a report that put out that said over the next decade, in order to sort of keep Rhode Island at, in a manageable area, and they consider it manageable. It's a little high, but it's manageable. They shouldn't float more than $1.5 billion in debt. So if Rhode Island goes ahead with working on the schools, and that's $500 billion, and we're talking just about the state, by the way, we're not talking about municipalities, we'll also take on their own debt. So it's $500 million, so that would leave $800 million in the rest of for other general obligation bonds that the voters approve. But every year in the last decade or so, the state has averaged about $190 million in bonds, and some years it's been much more than that. So that would be sort of the max, but if you look at what these other, so it would be the max in order to keep it manageable, right, if they just did that. But there are so many other projects that the state is looking to do that it would be very difficult then without getting into what would be considered unmanageable territory.
And in addition to future projects, the state still owes money on some of the projects that were approved in years past.
Oh yeah, there's a lot. I mean, debt, they take on this debt, it's not for 5 years. I mean, it's a 10, 20, 30, some maybe even 30 years, just like a mortgage. I mean, you think about it that way. I mean, you take out a mortgage in order to be able to buy something that you couldn't buy in cash. Well, it works that way for the state, but the problem is, the state's revenue has been spotty at times, and especially if there's a recession, which it's about time for another one, or a little depression, a little bump in the road, and that will have an effect on state revenue as well.
I think too you have the situation where politicians elected now say, let the successor to my office deal with it later, and that not always often gets a state into trouble.
Oh, I would say that it never works out, Frank. It never works out, because somebody eventually has to, you either have to cut expenses or raise taxes. Those are the only two options for a government. Nobody likes to do either of them, and there's been a lot of cutting in the last few years, and there's really very little, as you can tell, very little appetite to raise taxes.
Oh my, and there's a lot more about it in the current edition of the Providence Business News. This is also the week where they have a special supplement, the PBN Business Women Awards. And Mark, we thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Frank.